Ladies and gentlemen, as a part of the annual conference of the era, we have arranged a special lecture on redirecting agriculture and food policy towards nutritional security. This lecture will be delivered by Dr. Prabhu Pingali, a reputed policy economist and a well-known in the academic circles. I extend a warm welcome to Dr. Prabhu Pingali on behalf of ERA and the Indian Veterinary Research Institute. I request the director, R.K. Singh, to offer me a bouquet and a shawl. Thank you, Dr. R.K. Singh Sahab. Thank you, Prabhu, for accepting our, reception. I also welcome Dr. P.K. Joshi, Director, IRRI, South Asia, who is chairing this session. I request Dr. R.K. Singh to offer me a floral bouquet as well as a shawl. Thank you, Dr. R.K. Singh. Thank you, Dr. Joshi, for accepting our small memento. I also, it's a great pleasure. I also welcome the dynamic director and the vice chancellor of IRRI, who will be delivering a talk after the address by Prabhu Pingali. So in this program, we have a special lecture by Prabhu Pingali, followed by the lecture by Dr. R.K. Singh, the director and the vice chancellor of this university. I welcome everyone here. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Professor R.K. Singh, Professor Changappa, Professor Dr. P.K. Joshi. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon to talk to you all. Let me start, since most of you don't know much about the Tata-Cornell program. I think I'll just give you a few words about that before I start my lecture. So the Tata-Cornell Institute was set up about 5 years ago at Cornell University. And it was set up with a very large gift which was given by Mr. Tata. And the gift was given by Mr. Tata to set up the center. And to set up a center of excellence on agriculture and nutrition, to understand why we still have such high levels of malnutrition, especially in rural areas. And with a focus on India as an initial point. So right now, we have one of the largest programs focused on malnutrition in India that's operating from an academic university outside of India. And right now, we have 12 PhD students in the program, and we are building up to having 16 PhD students. So every year, we are bringing in 4 new PhD students into the program, and 4 students are graduating out of that program. And we're a cross-campus program, so we have PhD students who are in applied economics, in nutrition, in animal science. In fact, the lady walking down there is a PhD student in animal science, Maureen Valentine. We have PhD students in plant science or soil science, sociology, etc. So it's a broad cross-section, multidisciplinary group of students, all focused on understanding why India continues to have such high levels of malnutrition, even as growth is taking place. So it's a really exciting program that we're operating. We also have 4 postdoctoral fellows and several visiting scientists in the program as we are building up. Now, one of the requirements that we have for our PhD students is that they have to spend 1 year living and working in rural India. So we have students who are working today. Our student in animal sciences just finished 1 year in Kandhamal district in Orissa. We have a student who's working in Jharkhand. We have a student in Maharashtra, southern Maharashtra, in Chandrapur district. And also in Gorakhpur, starting next week, we have a student going into Gorakhpur for a year. And each of these students spends a year in the field in a fairly remote rural environment, and does action-oriented field research that contributes to their PhD. And so we're not only training students, providing them the best technical knowledge and technical skills, but we're also instilling in them this deep passion for doing on-the-ground, action-oriented research. And so they end up as development specialists who can actually say, we've been there, we've seen it, and we know what rural India looks like. And we've actually experienced that by living there for a year. So these are both Indian students who are part of the program. About half our students are Indian students, and the other half are American and other nationalities. Now let's go on to my main talk today. What I want to talk about is how do we get to a more nutritious food system in India. I think if we step back and ask ourselves, what has been one of the singular biggest achievement that India has seen in the last 50 years, I think the biggest achievement that we've seen in the last 50 years is we've been able to avert starvation, avert famines. In 1955 and 1960, there were a lot of people around the world who were talking about triage. Triage meaning that you cut some parts of the body so that the rest of the body can survive. So to sacrifice some population so that the rest of the world can survive. And the populations that people were talking about sacrificing was much of Asia. There was this feeling that India will never be able to feed itself, and China will never be able to feed itself, and Indonesia will never be able to feed itself. And so if Asia was sacrificed, the rest of the world would be able to survive. This is not something that people made up. There were actual conferences around this. There were actual research papers written about this. But we were able to show by 1970 that India was not going to starve, and neither was China or Indonesia. The Green Revolution, which started in 1967, had a phenomenal effect on turning the food security situation around. And the investments that took place in staple crop productivity growth, rice and wheat productivity growth, had a phenomenal effect on food security in India and the rest of Asia. And that led to the transformation that took place in Asia and the rapid economic growth that took place in Asia. So, as I talk today, I think it's important to remember that we don't want to minimize the enormous contribution that staple crop productivity growth made to India, and the continued need for maintaining staple crop productivity growth into the future. But as we look ahead, I think the food situation in India is facing several new challenges. It's no longer an issue of can we feed the population we have. It's a question of what are some of the new challenges that the food system in India is facing. And some of the new challenges that the food system is facing is, one, a rapid change in diets that's happening. And changing diets, the demand for diet diversity, and how do we meet that demand for diet diversity? In the same way that we met the demand for staple crop productivity. And second is to look at how do we design the food system in order that it meets nutrition outcome. It's not just enough that we meet the demand for diversity. You can meet the demand for diversity, but the quality of the diet may not be as good and may not meet the nutrient requirements as well. So how do you change that? How do you make it a more nutritious food system? And third, how do you make that food system more affordable to the poor? Because that's where your chronic malnutrition is. So how do you make the food system more nutritious but more affordable? And the last challenge, I think, is for the food system is how do you make the current safety net programs, the PDS program, the ICDS program, the midday meal program, more nutritious and more nutrition sensitive, and move them away from the high-calorie bias that the food system has. So let's start and look at what's happening with income growth. So we know, we've seen this rapid growth in income that's taking place in India. You've seen the rapid growth in middle-class populations in India. And with that change, and with urbanization happening, and urbanization is moving very rapidly, and by 2030, we are anticipating that the extent of urbanization will go up to 50% of population relative to where we are today, which is 30%. So that's going to be an enormous growth in a very short time period. So with all these changes, with income growth, with urbanization, we do see a diet transition. The diet transition going from a staple grain-based diet to a diet that will see increasing amounts of consumption of vegetable, fruit, and other horticulture products, milk, dairy, and livestock products, and of course, processed food also. That's going to come in, and that change in diet is happening, and it'll happen further and further as you look ahead. And some of the data that we have from the National Sample Surveys shows some of that diet transition, but I think right now we are still underestimating the extent of the transition that's happening and looking ahead to see how much more that is. Now, it's important for us to understand that it's not just the middle class populations and it's not just the rich populations that will see the changes in diets. We see that even among the poor, there's significant income growth happening, and with that, you'll see the diet change even at the lower income levels also. May not be as fast, may not be as big a change, but the change is happening, and that change will happen as poverty levels in the country start to fall. And some of the data that the National Sample Survey has, which looks at per capita calorie consumption that's coming from staples, shows quite clearly that if you look at the decade between the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, you see a fairly sharp decline in per capita calorie consumption coming from staples in all income groups except the lowest income group. And that data, as you look at more recent surveys, you see a much sharper change there. So this diet transition that we see in India is not a transition that's restricted to the high income groups. It's a transition that you're beginning to see across all income groups, and that's an important point for us to remember. Now, there are certain cautionary remarks here, and I'm not quite sure you'll see this graph as clearly. But the cautionary remark is that there is significant differences in the extent to which poverty reduction has taken place regionally. And this is something you know more than I do. And so we know that many of the states in the eastern part of the country are progressing slower than the states in some of the states in the northwestern part and the southern part of the country. And with that, the extent to which poverty reduction and rural poverty reduction has taken place is much faster in the south and in the northwest part of the country relative to the eastern part of the country. And with that, you also see that there's significant differences in consumption patterns. So you see that the extent of consumption diversity in both in terms of cereals, but also in terms of protein consumption, is significantly different in the more rapidly growing states relative to the lagging states, especially the states in eastern India. So the graphs that you have here show the spatial difference that exists today in consumption patterns, where the eastern states, states in the middle of the country, tend to have much more predominant dependence on staple grain consumption relative to the southern states and the northwestern states, where diversity of diets is much more common and is becoming a bigger change in consumption patterns in those states. So these are some of the existing changes in diets. But as you look towards 2030, I think we should all be clear that many of these trends will be magnified substantially. And as you look towards 2030, we should be anticipating Indian diets to be significantly different relative to where we are today. I want to talk about a second set of issues. The second set of issues, one, we started this lecture on a very positive note that there is income growth, and with that income growth, you begin to see diet change and diversity. But the second part of the story is to say that even as you see this growth, you see some malnutritional challenges that continue to persist. There's a set of chronic malnutrition problems that India has faced for decades. And our progress in reducing these challenges has been limited, or hasn't been as fast as it ought to be. At the same time, we are beginning to see new nutritional challenges coming up in terms of obesity and in terms of non-communicable diseases. And we need to understand the extent of these new trends and how do we manage them. How do we manage the chronic problems of malnutrition, such as stunting and wasting, especially for children, and the new and emerging nutritional challenges? And that's something we should all be concerned about. So again, if you think spatially, we see that the problem of child stunting and child underweight for children under 5 is a major concern as you look at states across the middle of India and the eastern parts of India. And that's true for both for stunting issues and for child underweight. There's been progress that's been made in the southern part of India with increased growth in incomes. But even in these states, the extent of malnutrition measured in terms of child stunting is still very high. It's still higher than countries which have reached the same level of income growth. And that's puzzling for India. It's puzzling that we've not been able to address this problem of child stunting and child underweight in a much more dramatic fashion, in the same way as we've addressed hunger. We've addressed hunger in a much more dramatic fashion then we are able to address child stunting and underweight. Now, again, maybe it's not easy to see these graphs. So one thing that we've done in my program is to try and look at across states in India and to look at differences across states in India. And what you're beginning to observe is that micronutrient malnutrition, especially iron deficiency, continues to be a major sticking problem in India. Anemia continues to be a major problem for women in India, especially for adolescent girls and for young women in India. And that the problem of anemia continues to be highly prevalent even as income growth is taking place, and continues to be prevalent even in middle-class populations. And it's true in urban as well as in rural setting. There's been some progress as income has grown and in states where you see higher income growth. But even then, that progress has been very limited. Okay? Second, if you look at underweight, women with body mass index of less than 18.5, underweight women. Now there you see some progress happening. You see that states like Punjab and Haryana and Tamil Nadu and Goa and Andhra Pradesh, etc., have seen significant improvements. But states such as Bihar and Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, etc., continue to have very high levels of underweight of women. So that there you do still see the problem of food security in terms of not having access to adequate amounts of food. Okay? But then look at the third picture. The third picture at the bottom shows you the extent of overweight women. So extent of women with body mass index greater than 18.5. And here you see the reverse of the previous situation. You see Punjab and Haryana and Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh and Goa and Kerala having higher levels of obesity and overweight relative to the rest of the population. And that's a very interesting feature that's coming up, is if you look across at these states here, and that's where you have Bihar and Chhattisgarh, etc., these states have very high levels of population that are underweight and very low percentage of population that are overweight. Okay? And then you come down to Delhi and Punjab and Tamil Nadu, Goa, etc. And here the percentage of population that's overweight is very high, and the percentage of population that's underweight is low. But it's not that low. Even at the lowest level, you still have about 20% of the population that's underweight. Okay? While you have about 25 to 30% of the population that's overweight. So you're beginning to see a dual burden coming up. You're beginning to see the population within the same populations. You begin to see the problem of underweight and overweight happening together. Now, what's really interesting is you're beginning to see the problem of the dual burden of underweight and overweight existing within the same family. Okay? Within the same family, you'll have people who are overweight and people who are underweight. And this comes out of the National Family Health Survey data. And what's interesting is if you look at the states, take Kerala for example. Kerala has almost 10% of households which have both underweight and overweight populations, or overweight family members. And so if you look at the first few states here, the most progressive states in terms of per capita income, these are the states which now have the highest amounts of the dual burden of underweight and overweight within the same family. And then go to the states which are lagging behind, Bihar and Jharkhand and Orissa, etc. In these states, you still have the primary problem of underweight, and overweight is not a big issue. The message that I want to leave you with today about this is, while we are addressing the chronic problems of underweight and the chronic problems of micronutrient malnutrition, we should also be gearing up to look at the problems of obesity and non-communicable diseases. This is not a problem that's going to go away. This is a problem that we're going to face way into the future. And one of my students has been doing an analysis of what's the social cost of increasing obesity trends in India. And her estimate is that by 2030, the overall public health cost of managing obesity will be substantially higher than the public health cost of managing undernutrition. Okay? So as we look forward, this is going to be a major public health concern that we should be thinking about. Now, I believe the solution to underweight and the solution to overweight is the same thing. The solution is better quality food. Food that is higher in nutrition, food that has diets with high levels of horticulture products, products which have high levels of micronutrients and vitamins, will address both the problems of underweight populations and the problems of overweight populations. So we should be looking at how do you create a food system that's nutrition sensitive, and a food system that goes beyond the current focus that we have on staple grains, okay? That's where we should be. But what does the food system look like today? The food system that we have today, and this data comes from looking at the food balance sheets of India. The food system that we have today is predominantly a staple grain food system in terms of calories. Much of the calories that we get today come from rice and wheat and some of the other major staples, but primarily rice and wheat. And when you think about vegetable products, when you look at non-staple products, much of that is vegetable-oriented products. There's some progress on consumption of animal-based products, but it's very small. You've gone from about 6% of total consumption coming from animal-based products to about 8% or so in the last 50 years. So that's been a very slow progress. But that's where the big changes need to be happening in the food system. Again, if you look at where your major sources of energy are coming from today, the major sources of energy today are coming from staple grains. And where are the major sources of protein coming from today? We all talk about pulses as the main source of protein today. But actually, pulse consumption has dropped quite dramatically over this last 50-year time period. Whereas consumption, the main source of protein that we are seeing is coming from dairy and milk products, and not so much from pulses, which are now the main focus of food policy priority in India. And one of the reasons for that is pulse prices are going through the roof. And unless you change the price relationship, you won't see a change coming in terms of improved access to protein in the Indian diet, especially in the vegetarian Indian diet that we have. One of my postdoctoral fellows looked through the data on the food supply in India and tried to break it down in terms of access to micronutrients, access to iron and zinc and vitamin A. And she compared the time period 1990 and 2011 time period. And what her findings came to is that we have just about enough iron in the food supply system. I'm not talking about access, I'm talking about what's available in the supply system. And we have a little more than what we need in terms of zinc, but we fall way under the requirement when you think about vitamin A. Vitamin A levels are deplorable right now in the food system. And much of the vitamin A comes from vegetable products and from livestock products. And there's a huge gap there. But even, let's look at iron. The iron that's available today is not as easily absorbed by the body. Much of the vegetable source iron is not as easily absorbable as animal source iron. And the animal source iron is still very small in the food system today. So as you think about where do we need to set the priorities for addressing micronutrients and vitamins, that has to come from improving access to vegetable products and to animal-based products. And I think that's where the food security community needs to say, what are the options? What are the options for increasing access to milk and dairy products, access to meat products, access to horticulture products? And unless we get that right, we will not be able to address this micronutrient deficiency. And we don't have a clear link between the nutrition community and the food policy community in order to do a much more detailed analysis of access to food by nutrients. And we need to get much better at doing that. So, the next question that I'd like to ask is, we see this diversity happening, or the demand for diversity rising. And certainly the need for maintaining diversity is also rising. But is this agriculture supply system responding to this change? Are we beginning to see the system itself changing as demands are changing? Well, look at the data on prices. If you look at this blue line here, and that shows you what's happening to pulse prices. Pulse prices in India have gone up almost 3 times since about 2005, okay? And then the red line shows you what's happening to milk, which has gone up 2.5 times. And eggs, meat, and fish have gone up almost about 3 times. So in terms of prices, there's been a big shift in the relative prices of non-staples to staples. But you don't see a big shift in terms of actual supply of these crops. So if you look at actual supply, and here I've got a series of maps, and if you want hard copies of them, they're all available on our website, on the Tata-Cornell Institute website. You can actually download a whole series of maps which show what's been happening to Indian agriculture over time, looking spatially. So here's a story that we know very well. We know very well that since about the 1960s to the 2000s, this area that we are in today, the Indo-Gangetic Plain area, went from an area that was growing rice and wheat, but also had pulses and coarse grain and other diversified crops, to an area which became predominantly concentrated in rice and wheat. So it's now famously called the rice-wheat zone. It crowded out pulses, it crowded out coarse cereals, etc. Where did they go? Many of them went down into the middle of the country. So what happened to pulses and coarse cereals is they moved to lower and lower productive zones of the country. And so the productivity, R&D productivity did not keep up for the pulses, but they were also pushed to the lower productive zones. So overall pulse supply and coarse grain supply was really affected by this crowding out that took place during the Green Revolution. And so over time, you begin to see that the diversity of cropping dropped dramatically in these rice wheat areas, and the diversity of cropping improved across in the middle of the country. Okay? But the diversity here was very much captured by oilseed crops, such as soybean, etc., and by cotton, but not so much by the more nutritious pulses and the coarse cereals. And so you saw the pushing out of the Indian agriculture system of some of the most nutritious crops. And so what happened to pulses? Since 1960s to the 2000, the total area under pulses in the country dropped by 650,000 hectares. Okay? That was a significant drop, which was not compensated for by an increase in productivity. And so overall pulse supply dropped significantly. Now on fruits and vegetables, you have a slightly better story. You see across these seaboard areas, there's been an increase in horticulture production. And overall horticulture area went up by about 5 million hectares. But that's nowhere close to meeting the growing demand for horticulture products. And so you're beginning to see that relative prices of horticulture rising because supply hasn't kept up to demand. And the R&D on horticulture hasn't kept up in terms of increasing productivity of much of the horticulture products. So there's been this big gap as you look ahead. The one big area where there's been really positive change has been in milk systems. And that's because of very concentrated effort made by the government, I think, in promoting milk cooperatives and increasing milk productivity. And here's some very interesting graphs. The 1960s graph shows you, and what we tried to do here is look at female to male cattle. In the 1960s, much of the country's cattle population was primarily male. Female, the cow population and the female buffalo population was much lower relative to the male. And that was because most of that male cattle was used for draft power. But by the time you come to the 2000s, you find these purple areas growing. These deep purple areas show that there are 20 cows for every bull. Okay, so the population switched dramatically because you no longer were using male cattle for draft power. And also as artificial insemination started to come in, dairy cattle started to grow. Dairy cows and buffaloes started to grow. But look at the sort of the Bimaru states. There you see that change hasn't happened. There you still see the dependence on draft power and the lack of milk cattle, etc. And that's where I think one needs to make a lot more effort in promoting dairy production, promoting livestock production, etc. So let's come back to, so we're facing a supply problem in getting to more nutritious food. And how do we get to change that situation? Well, the only way you're going to change that situation is to look at smallholder agriculture and smallholder response. And look at what's happening to smallholder agriculture in India. In 1970, 70% of farming was done by people with less than 2 hectares. In 2011, that number went up to close to 85%. So a story that you all know very well. The number of small operations is actually increasing over time rather than decreasing. So as you look to the future, we need to say, how do you get these smallholders, people with less than 5 hectares, involved in the change process, involved in creating a more nutritious food system? What are some of the problems they're facing? In transitioning from a staple grain system to meeting the demand for diversity, increased demand for horticulture products, livestock products. I think the biggest constraint that smallholders are facing is that much of the agriculture policy today is still focused on the Green Revolution, is still the heritage of the Green Revolution, protecting staple crop productivity, promoting staple crop productivity. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying what it does is it prevents smallholders from having the incentives to diversify out of staple grains and to look at a more balanced food system. So, how do you create a system that gets you from the Green Revolution to one that addresses the needs of the Indian population today? That's one. The big policy change is, I think, the biggest constraint that you have. Second, the market infrastructure, especially rural market infrastructure, is not designed for perishable products. It's designed for grain. But perishable products require cold storage systems and transport systems that prevent spoilage, etc. And that's an area we need a lot more focus on. The third issue is that as you switch from staple grains to higher value products, the skill requirements are very different. Skill requirements are much higher. And one needs to have an extension system that allows us to go from having the skills to grow a good rice crop to the skills needed to grow a good tomato crop and a good livestock industry, etc. And that's a change that's slow in coming that we have. And finally, the transactions costs associated with connecting farmers to the market for smallholder farmers is very, very high. And we as a community, especially as a community of economists, haven't really addressed what these transactions costs are and how do we reduce these transactions costs. So if we don't do that, then getting smallholders to be involved in making the transition to being suppliers of a more diversified food system will be very limited. So what I've been calling for, and I've written a few papers on this, is calling for a more crop-neutral agriculture policy. Agriculture policy in India, but not just in India, across Asia, agriculture policy was always based on ensuring staple crop self-sufficiency. Now, which meant that agriculture policy was not crop neutral. It was a policy that promoted rice and wheat. Now, what you need to do is look at a policy that promotes overall productivity growth but not focuses on one crop. So it creates a more level playing field where market signals will allow you to decide how to invest on one crop or the other. So that's a big change that has to take place. Along with that change, you need infrastructure investments, you need market investments, especially in rural market infrastructure. And you also need a change in terms of the food security policies within the country. Much of the food security policy in the country is around ensuring stockpiles of rice and wheat. And how do you go from ensuring the procurement system that feeds into staple grain productivity to a more broad-based food security system. And the last point here is we need a way in which we can think about individual food security that's different from food self-sufficiency at a national level. And I think that disconnect is still very, very strong here, where every time we talk about food security, the policy response is we need to increase the stocks of rice and wheat. Whereas quite often the stocks of rice and wheat may be quite substantial, but access to those stocks may be more limited. So it may be an access issue rather than an availability issue. And I think separating out access and availability is a real food security challenge. My last set of comments that I want to make, I know I'm running way out of time here, is around the safety net programs. And again, it's an area that you know a lot about. India has some of the largest safety net programs that you see anywhere in the world. And these safety net programs are food-based programs. The PDS is one of them, the ICDS, the midday meal scheme, etc. We have a paper that's coming out that does a fairly detailed analysis around the political economy of these safety net programs. And the point that we make in the paper is that many of these programs were designed for objectives which are outside of nutrition, right? The PDS was designed as a hunger relief program. The ICDS was designed as a child development program. And the midday meals program was designed as a program to encourage enrollment in schools. But what happened over time is these programs ended up as programs where supply of staple grain-based food became one of the major instruments of these programs. So over time, you saw a link happening between the procurement systems for staple grains and these support programs for the poor through the safety nets. And that link has a very strong political economy factors associated with it. And delinking those two has been a major challenge. And when we talk about cash-based programs, as a successor to the existing food-based programs, the challenge, we can talk about the challenges of operationalizing cash-based programs. But I think the biggest challenge is delinking the political economy that creates a very powerful bond between the suppliers of staple grains and the beneficiaries of many of these safety net programs. There's a detailed paper on this that will be coming out from our group will be published in the near future. And one of the points we make in this paper is even with the National Food Security Act coming in, we don't see that much of a shift from the staple grain focus that there is for much of the safety net programs in the country. Even as we talk about bringing in pulses into the PDS or bringing other products into the PDS, I think unless you get to a point where the procurement system can be shifted dramatically out of staple grains, you won't be able to create that balance. So it's not a question of will somebody supply pulses into the PDS. It's more a question of will people have the incentive to shift from a procurement system that's staple grain oriented to a procurement system that promotes pulses and other crops into the system. I know our chairman, Dr. Joshi, has been thinking about this for a long time, and he has a lot that he can say about these issues. So let me wind up then So when you think about redesigning food policy for nutritional security, I believe there's several components to it. I believe one of the main issue is that we need to think about a renewed focus on agriculture, but a renewed focus on agriculture with an emphasis on diversification towards more nutritious crops, towards more nutritious livestock products. And certainly, the eastern part of the country requires a lot more effort than the rest of the country. And one needs to think about kickstarting agriculture productivity growth in the east in the same way as the Green Revolution kickstarted agriculture productivity growth in Punjab and Haryana in the late 60s. But I think the difference is that we need to think about kickstarting agriculture growth process in a crop neutral manner, which means invest more on the infrastructure, invest more on markets, invest more on creating incentives for farmers to get involved in enhancing productivity without saying, let's focus on one or two crops. And that's going to be a major challenge to look at. We need to look at ways in which you connect smallholders to value chains for horticulture and livestock products. And these value chains can be both public as well as private value chains. And I think the private is where much of the future action is going to come out. And also, one needs to think about intersectoral and interdepartmental convergence on nutritional goals. As you think about nutrition, at a ground level, the ICDS and the midday meal scheme and the PDS, they all operate as different systems with very little convergence across these systems. But if we thought about common nutritional goals and how do you create instruments for achieving these goals, one would see that there would be greater convergence happening across these systems. And now I've done something out there. So that convergence is an area where a lot more action needs to happen than it is today. There's a lot of talk today about moving from food-based systems to cash-based systems. And I think that's where the future is going to be. But I think that future depends a lot on how you manage the political economy around staple grain procurement. And it depends a lot on whether we are able to decouple consumer welfare objectives from producer protection objectives. The producer protection objectives around staple grains relative to the consumer welfare objectives around the safety net programs. As economists, I think our biggest food policy priority in India today is to understand that political economy dimension and to figure out how to manage that transition as you go to a more nutritious food system. So with that, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If you want to know more about the Tata-Cornell Institute or the work we do, you can visit our website. You can read some of the blogs our students blog from the field, and also you can follow us on Twitter. Thank you. Bye.